Hello, everybody. A few people joining. Perfect. For those of you who are already here, who have already joined, if you could just let me know in the chat whether you can hear me okay, that would be great. Just bring the chat up. If anyone wants to comment whether you can hear me okay or not, that would be perfect. Hear you perfect. Thank you so much. For anyone who's joining us, thank you so much for letting me know you can hear me. For anyone who's joining us, if you want to feel free to let me know where you're from, what your job is, just so I kind of know who my audience is, that would be really great. I'm a speech therapist. I'm not sure if you knew that it was going to be presented by a speech therapist, but that's my job. And I'm based in France, so it's really late at night for me. It's about 10 p.m., but that's okay. Wanted to make sure we could get as many people as possible in the time zone. So, what up? 14 people. Oh, another speech therapist. Perfect. I think with the title being speech sound disorders, I feel like I was going to attract mostly speech therapists, but we'll see. The one I did last webinar, the webinar I last did was on language delay, and I thought it would be mostly speech therapists, and it was not. There was not that many speech therapists, so that threw me for a loop. Okay, we have an OT. Perfect. I work really closely with an OT. Love that profession. I think if I wasn't a speech therapist, I would have been an OT. Oh, for anyone who's typing in the chat, can you just make sure that your messages are sent to all panelists, just if you have any questions during the chat. I know the speech pathologist, perfect. Pediatrics person, oh my goodness, awesome. Educational psychologist, great, perfect, nice mix here. Yeah, so what I was saying, if you're typing a question in the chat during the webinar, just make sure that you select all panelists so that everyone can see it. Sometimes what happens is like you can discuss amongst yourselves while I'm presenting, because I won't be able to check your questions while I'm presenting. I will check them at the end, but if you can discuss amongst yourselves, it makes it a little easier sometimes. Another speech pathologist from Canada. Perfect. So tonight I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes of webinar, and then I'll have about 20 minutes at the end for your questions if you have any questions at the end. We are going to be doing a little bit of a presentation, and then I'll do some case studies at the end, so hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to see the things that I'm talking about in practice. Another OT. Oh, someone using Forbrain with their son. Oh, very interesting. And he has difficulty with his R. R is for sure the hardest consonant for English. And I think for a lot of languages, R is kind of a weird one, but for sure for English, it's the worst consonant, horrible to learn, difficult to teach. It's a really awful sound. Got 19 people, a learning coach, cool. We'll give it just maybe one more minute, see if there's any kind of late stragglers to the webinar, and then we'll get going. So for those of you just joining, what I was saying was if you want to type questions during the webinar, I will get to them at the end, but I won't be checking them while I'm presenting. So you can either type them in the chat window, that's totally fine. I will check it at the end, or you can type them in the little Q&A box. Either way, it's fine. Someone can't see comments. I'm not sure why you can't see comments, I'm sorry. I think everyone so far. Oh, maybe you actually need to click on all panelists and attendees. That's what we were missing. If you could click your chat messages to all panelists and attendees, I think that might be what's missing. I'm not sure what it counts as a panelist for Zoom. I'm sorry. I'm not great with technology. All panelists and attendees. Okay, perfect. You got it. All right, well, let's get going. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see what my presentation looks like. This up. All right, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about using Forbrain in speech and language therapy sessions, and our topic tonight is going to be speech sound disorders. So this is my second webinar in the series. The first one was a couple of weeks ago on language delay, and this one's going to be speech sound disorders, and then I'll do another one later on, probably in June, about working with children with autistic spectrum disorder. So if you have questions about children with autistic spectrum disorder, you can save those until next webinar. So who am I? Well, my name is Grace. I'm a speech and language therapist from New Zealand. I grew up in New Zealand, did all of my training in New Zealand, worked for a little bit there, and then I moved to France. And I set up my private practice in France about 7 years ago now. I'm working mostly in early intervention, so I work a lot with language delay, I work a lot with speech sound disorders and autistic spectrum disorder, among other things. I work a little bit with school age, but really my specialty is early intervention. And I've been using Forbrain since 2017. I was introduced to it by my colleague who's an occupational therapist. Shout out to the occupational therapist listening. She introduced me to Forbrain, and I thought that is a really interesting use of technology, and I thought this could be really beneficial for some of the kids I work with, so I wanted to give it a go. And so I've been using it for almost 3 years now, and I really like it. It's a really nice tool to have in my therapist toolkit, so I just wanted to share with you how I use it. So the population we're talking about is children with speech sound disorders. This is a relatively new term. It wasn't the term that we used when I was studying to be a speech therapist. I think it's a few years old now, this term, but basically it's describing any disorder that includes articulation or phonology. So really how a child's speech sounds. We are going to be talking a little tiny bit about motor speech disorders, which are not speech sound disorders. That's something different, but we will touch on them just a little bit tonight. One of our case studies has a child with a motor speech disorder as well as a speech sound disorder. So the age group that we're looking at for speech sound disorders is kind of like 3 and 4 and then up through school age. Under 3, not so much. We wouldn't really see that. So what is Forbrain? Well, I have my Forbrain here. Maybe some of you already have a Forbrain. I'm not sure. Get it out and show you. So Forbrain is this little headset. We put it on like so, behind the ears. This always gets caught on my ponytail. Ugh. All right, so we have our microphone here. We have our dynamic speech filter. And then we have these little blue discs, which sit, if you can see, just on my bone here. They're not really in my ear, they're just in front on the bone. So our microphone, our dynamic filter, and our little things that sit on our bones that use bone conduction. So what happens when we're using Forbrain is we speak, our voice is picked up by the microphone, goes through the dynamic speech filter, and then the message is relayed to these little discs that use bone conduction to stimulate the auditory nerve directly. So what ends up happening is we hear our voice in real time as we're speaking, slightly amplified. It's a really, really strange sensation, and I encourage you, if you have a Forbrain, if you haven't tried it, definitely try it because it's really, really weird. Can be a little bit off-putting for some. I find it really unnerving to hear my voice so loudly, but some people really like it. They enjoy the kind of extra boost of hearing their own voice. In terms of speech and language therapy, when we're looking at this device, it falls under the category of altered auditory feedback devices. And the way that alters our auditory feedback is simply by amplifying our speech in real time. It's designed to be used as a complementary tool, so it's not meant to replace anything that we're doing as therapists. It's just meant to kind of boost or enhance the things that we're already doing, the evidence-based practice methods that we're already using. One thing that's nice about the Forbrain is that, I mean, you can turn it on and off, which is great, but you can also adjust the volume. So for kids who need a little bit more input, you can make it louder, or for kids who are maybe a little more sensitive, you can turn down the volume. And the other thing that I really, really love about it for most of my population I work with is that it's wireless. So we can be on the move and wearing the Forbrain, and it's easy, doesn't fall off, no problems. The auditory vocal loop. So we had some questions about this in the last webinar, and I wanted to address it in this webinar just in case you had any questions, but also it's really important for the population that we're talking about for children with speech sound disorders. So the auditory vocal loop, it's a natural process. We're all doing it all the time when we're speaking. I'm doing it right now. It's when we speak, we perceive our speech, we hear it, we then analyze what we've just heard, and then we can adjust our speech. If we've heard any mistakes or anything, we can adjust it. So we're constantly doing this loop as we're speaking. When we're wearing the Forbrain, it enhances the perceive part. We have the microphone, we hear our voice slightly louder. So the perceive part of the auditory vocal loop is enhanced, which makes it a little bit easier to analyze. The message is just slightly clearer, louder, more present, easier to analyze, which of course makes it then easier to adjust. The auditory vocal loop is really important when we're talking about children with speech sound disorders because it involves two processes. It involves a lot of auditory discrimination, so being able to discriminate between different sounds. And also it involves phonological awareness. So awareness of sounds, awareness of their place in words, and kind of being able to manipulate that. So these two skills are skills that children with speech sound disorders are typically poorer at than their peers. So if we can do something to give them a bit of a boost in this auditory vocal loop, then it could be really beneficial for these kids with speech sound disorders. So my tips for introducing Forbrain. Well, I think the first thing that I like to do when I introduce Forbrain is just to show the child the Forbrain. We can let them touch it. It's very sturdy and stable. It's not fragile at all, so we can let the child touch it. I've even had a child literally stomp on my Forbrain, and it's totally fine. It still works perfectly. So yeah, really sturdy, really stable. We can let the child touch it, manipulate it, no problem. And then I'll show them how I wear it. So I'll pop it on my head. Say, oh my goodness, this is so cool. I like it. Wow, oh, I can hear myself. And so I'm showing how it looks on me. If I have a parent in on the session, I will show how it looks on mom or on dad or whoever is with the child. And I'll use an excited expression and excited vocalizations just to show that this is something cool and exciting and not really something to be scary, wary, or scared of. After I've shown how it looks on myself, I'll say, okay, it's your turn. Let's have a go on you. And I'll let the child try it on for themselves. The important part of letting the child try it on for the first time for me is to make sure that they can see how they look. So I'll always either have a mirror, oops, lost all my text, sorry everyone, a mirror or a cell phone camera present just on selfie mode so that they can see what they look like. This is really, really important because children often think that they look super, super cool with the Forbrain. It can be a bit of a strange sensation just to have it sitting on your ears and have your loud voice in your ears. But if they can see how they look, then they're often a little bit more motivated by that. We could also take photos and videos to send home with them later just to talk about this fun thing that they did in therapy. Sometimes we will work with children who are a little bit more sensitive. And when we're trying to introduce Forbrain with children who are a bit more sensitive, we just need to take our time. There's no rush. We can take our time, no problem. The first thing I would recommend would be just trying to take turns. So if we're working with a child with speech sound disorders, we're doing like a lot of flashcard type stuff. We might have for one flashcard, it's my turn. And I do my little flashcard. I've got a flashcard right here. Golf. Okay, next flashcard, it's your turn. I'll take it off, put it on their hand, their flashcard, gap, etc. For some kids, that's enough. For some, we just need to even take even more time and just drag it out a little bit more. So for the kids who are more sensitive, who are a bit funny about having it on their ears or about having a loud noise in their ear, their turn could just be to have it sitting next to them and just getting used to them tolerate having it near them. So their turn might be to have it next to them in their lap or on their belly, on their shoulders, and we can play around with it. Like if a child has a little bit of language, we can ask them, where should we put it next? Where do you think? Should we put it on your shoulders? Shall we put it on your chin? Like be a little bit silly. There's no problem, just to kind of warm them up to it. And then eventually we do want to get it on their ears. If a child has an issue with either the loudness or with the sensation of the ears, we don't have to do it all at once. Like we can just get them used to having it, used to the sensation of having it on your ears without having it turned on. So getting them used to just having it sitting like this with it off for a little while, and then slowly begin to fade it in by turning it on, by keeping the volume really low, and then kind of turn it up as they get used to it. This process may happen in one session or it may take multiple sessions, and that's totally fine. We just don't want to scare the child. We don't want to rush them. We want them to do it in their own pace. For some children, it may never happen, and that's fine too. Some children are really, really hypersensitive with their ears, and so this is just not the tool for them. It's not a one-size-fits-all product, but for the kids that it does work for, it really makes a difference. So the recommendations per day, if we're working with children under 5, we're talking about 10 minutes per day. And for children aged 5 to 15, 15 minutes per day. So those are the official recommendations on the Forbrain website. I did have some therapists in the last webinar that we did say that they'd used it for longer and they'd found that it was fine. So, I mean, you just have to use your clinical judgment and see what works for your client. But those are the recommendations from the Forbrain website. So how to use Forbrain in speech and language therapy sessions. Like we said, it's a complementary tool. So it's designed to be used alongside the things that we're already doing as therapists. So we're just doing what we're doing, but we're using Forbrain. And I could literally end the presentation there. I could just say, do what you're doing, but put the Forbrain on, but I won't. We will do some examples and I'll give you some case studies for some of the kids that I've worked with. So once we've assessed a child, we've said that they have a speech sound disorder, the first thing we want to do is to choose our targets. So we can consider a few different things when we're choosing targets for a child. The first one that I like to consider is what's developmentally appropriate for the child. So when we're choosing targets for speech sound disorder, we might either be looking at specific sounds for articulation, or maybe phonological processes if they're more the phonology kind of kid. Phonological processes, for those of you who aren't speech therapists, are the ways that young children simplify adult speech. They're a part of typical development, but if a phonological process drags on for too long, then we can call it like a delay or a disorder. So typically, like a 2-year-old, instead of cookie, they might say tootie, and that's totally fine for a 2-year-old. But if a child is still doing that at 4 or 5, then there might be a problem and we might need to address it. So I've just linked down here a resource with the phonological processes, the age that they typically disappear by, and then also the ASHA consonant acquisition chart, so the age that we typically expect a child to have mastered a consonant. You can see there's quite a wide range, but yeah, there are the resources for you if you wanted to check out. The next thing that I like to consider are sounds that are specific to the client. So this is a crazy one. I don't know why, but I find that kids that I work with often have a difficult time with a sound in their name. So like the first client that I ever worked with, he was called Levi, but he was gliding his L, so he was saying Yevi instead. He was 5, so we can expect the L to still kind of be developing around 5, but because it was an important sound to him, we definitely wanted to include it for the sounds that we were working on. And the last one is the impact on the intelligibility. So we'll see this in a case study later on. I was working with a little girl called Josie, and she had a very difficult time with her S sound. She was 4 years old, so it is a sound that can still be developing at 4 years old, but just the way that she was replacing it, she was substituting it with a L sound, which made her really, really unintelligible. So even though she was kind of developmentally appropriate, we definitely wanted to address that sound just because of its impact on her intelligibility. So those are the 3 things that I kind of consider when I'm choosing targets for working with children with speech sound disorders. Once I've chosen my targets, I'm going to start the therapy. And before we do any type of speaking, I want to make sure that the child can hear the difference between the different sounds or between the different phonological processes. So we're going to do auditory discrimination. This is just listening and discriminating. There's no pressure on the child at this point to produce the sound. So obviously we're not using the auditory vocal loop. The goal is not that the child is speaking. So what we can do, we can have the child wearing the Forbrain, and we can turn the microphone towards our mouth while we are modeling the sounds. It just makes them a little bit louder, a little bit clearer, a little bit more input for the child. So I like to compare the target sound versus the substitute sound. And I will always use these speech sound posters here. I love these. These are a resource I got from Teachers Pay Teachers from Jenna Ray Kirkburn from Speech Room News. I've linked it down there because I use these all the time with every kid that I work with, basically. They're really nice speech sound posters. You can see the mouth shape. We also have whether the sound is voiced or voiceless. This is a T, so it's a voiceless sound. Our voice is off. For a sound like a D, we can see our voice is on. And then we show how the sound is made. So this one is a stopped sound, so it has a stop sign. T, it's a stop sound compared to a fricative sound, which is a more continuous sound where our arrow keeps going. So it's like and it also has these really cute little reminders here, like this little snake sound. So, oh, make your snake sound. Or the other one I really like is the ticking clock for our ticking clock sound. So it's important to have visuals for auditory discrimination activities because obviously when we're asking the child, which sound did you hear? If they can't make the sound yet, they're not going to be able to tell you which one they heard. So we want to make sure we have something that they can point to show us which sound they heard. So when we're doing these types of activities, we can start with the sound in isolation, so just the sound by itself. Once they're really, really accurate in isolation, I would honestly say like 95 to 100% accuracy in isolation. We really want to make sure they're hearing that sound well. We can work on it into initial positions. So it might be in short words, like even one syllable words, like key versus tea. And then we could also try it in final positions, like lake versus late. I wouldn't necessarily go beyond that. We don't really need to work on it in medial position. If we know the child is discriminating well, in isolation, in initial and final position, I would just move on to teaching the placement of the sound. So teaching the sounds, this is important one where we're going to be using our Forbrain. Maybe not right to begin with. First, we teach the placement. So we want to make sure that the child can use their tongue, their lips, and their teeth really well, that they know where their tongue and their lips and their teeth are in their mouth, and that they're okay with moving them. So if a child has poor oral-motor awareness, we'll often do like a lot of play with a mirror and just getting them used to kind of moving their mouth so that when I say put your tongue up, they know where their tongue is and they can put their tongue up. This is just important for when we're teaching the placement of sounds afterwards. Like imagine I'm teaching a D sound to the child afterwards and I'm like, put your tongue behind your teeth, but they don't know where their tongue is and they don't know where their teeth are, then they can't follow that instruction. So we can do a little bit of work on just getting aware of where our mouth is, our lips and our tongue and our teeth are before we ask them to produce the sound. Once we're confident that they can place their articulators in the right place, we can work on producing the sound in isolation, and this is where we're going to use our Forbrain. So when we're working on actually producing sounds wearing the Forbrain, because I do like to have children looking at their mouth just to make sure that they're kind of monitoring their own placement. We don't want to have the microphone in front of their mouth. So I like to have it like down here, or even like a little bit out to the side is fine. The ideal distance from the mouth is 3 centimeters, but you can honestly have it 3 centimeters out to the side, 3 centimeters down, it's just fine. We just wanna make sure that they can see their lips, that they can see their teeth, that they can see their tongue really, really clearly if they're looking in a mirror. So we wanna teach the sound in isolation, and we wanna make sure that they can really hear the sounds that we're making, which is why the Forbrain is useful. Afterwards, I might teach a sound in initial position or in final position, depends on the sound, depends on the child. Some children find it easier to put a sound at the end of the word. Some children find it easier to put the sound at the start of the word. Afterwards, we're gonna work on putting our sound in the middle of the word, and then eventually we're gonna build up to using phrases. So all of this sounds pretty boring so far. So one thing that it's important to include always is some type of structured game for the child to be playing with you. I've heard some of my friends who had speech therapy when they were kids, and they're like, I don't remember doing any work. All I remember is playing games. And I think this is what we do a lot of the time as speech therapists, is get children to do work, but disguise it as a game. So for articulation, it's often like really boring drill, work, flashcards. That's just what it is. So we always want to include some type of structured game to make it interesting for the child. So here are my favorite structured games. These are games that have like a lot of turn taking and like a very short, finite turn compared to something like pretend play where the turn is not necessarily defined and it kind of goes on for ages, like we might use when we're working with language delay. Those games are not as appropriate for when we're working with speech sound disorders. So these are my favorite ones. Pop-Up Pirate, which is, I think, my first ever game that I purchased when I got my private practice. So we might get the child to do a certain number of repetitions of their sound or a certain number of flashcards of their word, and then they get to pop a little sword into there. It didn't pop. Perfect. Another one that I really, really love, which actually my occupational therapist colleague introduced me to, is Ruff's House. It's this cute little dog's house with this flap, and it's got lots of little, like different textured bones inside, like a pink squishy one, or it's got like some harder ones. It's really, really fun, and it's got pairs. So that's a really, really fun one to use as well. Crocodile Dentist, like I'm using with my little buddy Aiden in the photo. And then if you have kids who are adrenaline junkies, then Shark Bite is a really, really good one. It's like this big shark mouth that you open up, and it's got fish on the inside, and you have to like fish them out. And every now and then the shark will like chomp on your hand. So for me, I find it absolutely terrifying, but I have a lot of clients who really, really like it, who are adrenaline junkies. So I will use it with those kids. When we get to the kind of stage of working on our sound in phrases, we can use toys like ones like Orchard Toys, if you're familiar with these games. Something like the shopping cart, where we have like a shopping trolley or shopping cart, our shopping list, and then all the little pieces. If we're working on our sh sound, for example, we could make a phrase like, I went to the shop to buy, and then pick up something from our cart. So it doesn't just have to be like that the game is an arbitrary reinforcer. We can also build our articulation activities into these games. Cycles approach. This is an approach that, I don't know why I'm wearing this for, I'm gonna take it off. This is an approach that I use quite often if a child has multiple sounds or multiple phonological processes that we're working on. So this is a little bit different to the traditional approach. The traditional approach is where we pick one sound and we work on it until it's mastered. And then we pick a new sound and we work on it until it's mastered. In the cycles approach, we're going to choose one or two sounds. So for example, we might choose our s and our z. We're going to work on them for a specific period of time. I normally do like maybe 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how many sessions I see the child for in a week. And then we're going to move on. Regardless of how much progress we made, we're going to move on to the next sound, which in this case is our ul. We're going to target that sound for 1 to 2 weeks, and then we're going to move on. And then we're going to target our k and g for 1 to 2 weeks, and then we're going to move on. And then we're going to repeat, and we're going to keep repeating this cycle until we've mastered all of the sounds. We can take the sounds out of rotation if we've mastered them. Say, for example, we master our s and our z after 5 weeks. We can take them out of rotation and just keep cycling through the other sounds. I really like this approach because it enables us to kind of keep it fresh and interesting. I find after a couple of weeks, a child is a bit over a sound, and then we just move on to something new, and it's a new sound, new activities, and it can be really, really nice. Some children don't do well with this approach. Some children have a hard time like maybe remembering which sound is which. They might get confused between the two sounds, especially if the sounds are similar. Like I have one little girl on my caseload at the moment. We're working on s and sh, and she's just getting completely confused between the two sounds. So I had been using a cycles approach, and now I'm going to stop that because I can see it's confusing her. We're just going to stick with traditional approach, one sound at a time, and master it before we move on. But cycles approach is an approach that I like to use quite a lot of the time if we're dealing with multiple sounds. Another approach is using opposition. So this is a bit of a complicated approach, but just we're going to simplify it tonight. We're going to say that oppositions are just words that differ by one sound. There are more details about which sound. There's maximal oppositions or minimal oppositions based on which sounds you choose, but basically it comes down to using words that differ by one sound. So we can see here on this resource, we have a word like see versus a word like she. And so these words differ by one sound, s versus sh. And what we're going to do is we're going to have like a board each. We're going to have cards in the middle. The child picks up a card and they're going to tell me which one they have. This is another really nice one to use our Forbrain for, because you can have the child wearing it like this. I'm going to put it back on. And what I've actually seen is some kids will pick up a card, say what they think it is, which is incorrect. So say, for example, this child is having trouble making their sh sound. They're replacing it with a s. So they might have picked up the card she, but they're going to say C because they're replacing the sh with this. So say, oh, I've got the C. And then they'll hear themselves because they have the Forbrain on. They can hear themselves a little bit louder. And then they'll be like, oh my goodness, that's not what I thought I wanted to say, and then be able to self-correct. One of the little clients, Josie, that we're going to talk about in just a minute, this was the exact case that we had with her. Like I said, she was replacing her s with u. She had had a really, really difficult time with self-awareness. She was absolutely adamant that she was saying things correctly. But having the Forbrain on for her really made a big difference. We were doing these oppositions one day, and she had a sock and a lock on her board, and she picked up a card and she was like, oh, I have the lock, and she meant to say sock, and she looked absolutely shocked, like she had just heard herself for the first time. And then she goes right into her microphone. She goes, I have the sock. I have the sock. And so she was able to self-correct just based on what she had heard, this nice clear input with her Forbrain. So when we're using oppositions, we're going to use our target sound versus our substitute sound, and we're going to use them in real words. We could also have our target sound versus our phonological process. So the other board that I have here down the bottom, these ones are working on final consonant deletion. So instead of house, the child was saying how. So deleting that final consonant. So we want to have words that have the final consonant in them versus words that don't have that final consonant present. It doesn't work for non-English sounds. This is just because we really want to use real words so that the words have meaning, so that if the child is using, if the child is producing a word that they realize is not the right word, it kind of still makes sense to them. I don't know why I keep putting this forward now. I'm going to take it off. It's actually really comfy to have it around my ears. Kind of like it, like wearing a seatbelt or something in the car. Anyway, those are oppositions, and I like to use those as well while we're using our Forbrain. The last strategy I like to use, or the last, I don't know, technique or program rather that I like to use when working with children with speech sound disorders is the Kaufmann speech to language protocol. Now this protocol was designed for children with childhood apraxia of speech, but it is also useful for speech sound disorders and for expressive language development. It's a very nice program to have as part of your therapist toolkit. So I've got the kit 1 and 2 of the cards. Some of them are better for working on phonological processes or like syllable shapes, and some of them are better for working on specific sounds. What's really nice about the cards is that it has this like hierarchy on the back. So you can see at the top the word that you're shooting for. For example, if we look at the crown one, the target word is crown, and then it simplifies it and it shows the different ways that we could simplify it. And so we can kind of see which level is the child at and which we could shoot towards next. I also have this workbook, which is really nice when we start working on the phrase level with sounds. But I will just say, if we're using this for children who don't have childhood apraxia of speech, we just need to be a little bit careful about the telegraphic speech. It does use a little bit of telegraphic speech where we're kind of getting rid of the small in between words. So for example, in this story, oops, my hair tangled. In this story, Moppy is putting on his pants, and instead of Moppy is putting on pants or Moppy put on your pants, it just says Moppy put on pants. So that's not grammatically correct. So if we're working with children who don't have childhood apraxia of speech, then we would want to model a grammatically correct phrase rather than what they have written there. All right, case studies, finally. So Josie, we've already talked about her a little bit tonight, but just wanted to go in a little bit more detail with her. For me, Josie was, I think, a really, really eye-opening case in terms of just how powerful the Forbrain can be when we use it in terms of children with speech sound disorders. So I hadn't had my Forbrain for very long when I started working with Josie. I would have maybe had it for like maybe 6 months. And so I was still kind of testing it out, seeing which clients it worked with, seeing where it didn't work so well. But Josie was one that really made me do a 180. I was like, oh my goodness, this is a really, really useful product. So Josie was a 4-year-old girl. And the thing about Josie was that she was incredibly unintelligible to unfamiliar listeners, but also not very intelligible to her own family. Like even to her mom, she was maybe like 50% intelligible, which is really low for a 4-year-old. We would expect a 4-year-old to basically be 100% intelligible to everybody. So the things that Josie was doing was she was using really unusual substitutions and also a lot of omissions. And she was really, really frustrated because she just didn't hear that her speech was different to everybody else's. So like a lot of the time she would say something like, I can't wind my lock and loo. And her mom is like, what are you talking about? Oh, you can't find your socks and shoes. And then Josie would scream, "Bat what I led!" Like she was just adamant, that's what I said. But she obviously couldn't say it. She would say, "Bat what I led." Like, oh my goodness, did you not just hear me say that? So she was really, really frustrated, very poor self-awareness. And it was also leading to issues with self-esteem. Like she didn't want to talk at school anymore. She didn't like introducing herself to strangers because they could never understand her. And she was just really, really angry and frustrated at home when people wouldn't understand her. So this is what Josie's speech looked like for the therapist, if you want to take a look at it. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically we can see she had a lot of issues with fricatives. So s, z, f, v, the th, th, and sh. She would also, at the start of the word, she tended to do a kind of unusual substitution. If it was in the middle or at the end of the word, she often would just omit them or do like a glottal stop, which is kind of the equivalent of omitting a sound. And she also had other more typical phonological processes as well, like gliding her so making a a W sound instead, stopping her affricates, so instead of doing a ch, she would do a t, and cluster reduction. So trying to think of one that doesn't have a s in it, like crown, she would say cown. Those were more typical because she was 4 years old. So this is an example of what Josie's speech looked like. For those of you who are familiar with the golden Frisco test of articulation, this is an assessment that I use when I'm working with children, well, when I get a referral for a child who is unintelligible. One of the subtests is connected speech subtest. So we tell a story to the child and then they have to tell it back to us. So this is Josie's extract from that test. They're talking about going fishing at an old bridge, and this is what she said. She said, "Be wit wamba old bwid, all a Aladdin, be here annoyed. It only a dog taking a wog. They cat were in wit. 1, 2, we, wa, why, lick, len, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 were in. By la because they are happy." So if you know this story, you might know what's going on. If you were unfamiliar with it, you might think, what on earth what was that about? So basically the story says, they fish from the old bridge. All of a sudden they hear a noise. It's only a dog chasing a frog. They catch 13 fish. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. They laugh because they're happy. So even something kind of simple like that becomes quite unintelligible quite quickly when we're making so many unusual substitutions and omitting so many sounds. Another thing that we would hear Josie say was, my name is Do'uween. I like to play lur and weku with my boa Benjamin. So again, her speech just kind of completely falls apart. Introducing herself, Do'uween, instead of Josephine, nobody could understand her when she would say her name. And lur and weku was her favorite game, search and rescue, which is a little Paw Patrol game that she loved to play. And her favorite thing in the world was Subway Lamwite. So Subway sandwiches, and she couldn't say it and no one would understand her when she said it. So she was having a really hard time. She was this little chatterbox who had so much to say, but no one would understand her when she was talking. So what did therapy for Josie look like? We did 2 times 30-minute sessions a week at her house, home-based therapy. We did a cycles approach, and we were doing our s and our z, our f and our v, and we cycled around like that, having sounds that had the same place of articulation but just differed in the voicing, and we cycled through like that. We used a lot of oppositions. This was a technique we used a lot with Josie, and speech sound posters, which she loved. She absolutely loved these. She actually requested the whole set, even for the sounds that she could make, and then she stuck them up around her bedroom, and she would just go through her sounds saying them or asking her mom when she wasn't sure what a sound was. She really loved those visuals. And of course, we used Forbrain. And for me, Forbrain was the absolute game changer for Josie. Like I was telling you before, when we were doing those oppositions with sock versus lock, it was the thing that really enabled her to like hear herself talking for the first time. And I had this really curious, when she put it on, she just wanted to make her target sounds into the microphone and listen to herself. She would just sit there going, s, s, shh. Like she would just sit there literally listening to her voice as if she had never heard it before. So I was thinking, this is a really curious tool. Like clearly this is really helping her gain some self-awareness about her speech. So progress for Josie. She actually began using target sounds in conversational speech after the second cycle. So we did 1 week of s and z, 1 week of and v, 1 week of and v. We cycled through again, and by that stage, so after 6 weeks of therapy, she was using all of those sounds in conversational speech. So we added in some new targets. We added in her sh, her ch, and her j. And then we were just fine-tuning. We were working on maybe particularly difficult words that had multiple targets. A word like fishing, where you have a f and a sh, maybe a little bit difficult for her. But, and oh, this was a really cute thing. She would come up to me at the start of each session and she'd say, Grace, I used to say, and she'd pick something, for example, Subway sandwiches, but now I can say Subway sandwiches. And she was so thrilled about her own progress. She was so thrilled that people could understand her, like something just really clicked for her. And she was discharged after only 10 weeks of therapy. For me, this was mind-blowing because when I first met her, I was thinking, this kid has so many difficult sounds that we have to work on and such poor self-awareness. And I felt she was going to be on my caseload for years. And after 10 weeks, she was done. She was speaking typically for her age. The only sound that we had left that we hadn't targeted was her because she was still only 4 years old. So we wanted to leave that a little bit more time. But all the rest of her sounds, she sounded like a typical 4-year-old. So I was like, oh my goodness, good job, Josie. Good job, Forbrain. That was a really nice client for me to see the efficiency of our Forbrain. My next case study, a little bit of a different one. So David, so he was a 3-year-old boy when I started working with him. He had a speech sound disorder, so he had a lot of phonological processes, more so than articulation. He had a lot of difficulty with like fronting. But he also had this motor speech element where he was very intelligible in single words, apart from the phonological processes, but he was quite intelligible in single words. But as soon as we got any connected speech, moving to phrases, 2 words together, it just all completely fell apart. He lost the motor pattern and became completely unintelligible. Same thing for like multisyllabic words, he had a really hard time with. So there was clearly an issue with the coordination going on. And the thing that was most difficult about David was he was super high energy absolutely bouncing off the walls. And we know for working with children with speech sound disorders, we do kind of need to sit and focus and do flashcards and look in a mirror. And like, there's a lot of kind of sitting and focusing and attending, maybe compared to something like language delay when we can be up and moving around a little bit more. So he was a hard one to kind of get him to stay still in one place for therapy. So therapy for David. We did 1 times 1 hour per week session that was just based on the family's availability. We used the Kaufmann speech to language protocol with him, working on those motor speech issues. We used oppositions with him as well, working on his phonological processes. And we used the Forbrain. And for him, the Forbrain was really interesting. He had actually the same reaction as Josie of wanting to wear it and really wanting to listen to himself say his target sound. So one of his target sounds was his k sound. So he would sit there going k, k, t, t, into his microphone, just like listening to his own voice. Really, really interesting. But the really curious effect of Forbrain on David was it really calmed him and focused him and centered him. And when he was wearing it, he was able to sit and attend and focus. And when he wasn't, he would be back off bouncing on the walls, running around, like really too much energy. So I thought that is a really, really curious effect of Forbrain that I was not expecting. So progress for David. He got much better at his multisyllabic words really, really quickly. He started making intelligible phrases really quickly as well. His family was very impressed with the progress he made. But the biggest one was his focus and attention. When he was wearing the Forbrain, he was able to sit and focus and attend and pay attention to an activity. And he was motivated to participate. I think he really liked wearing it. And he did have to continue therapy later on to work on his and which are notoriously difficult sounds, especially for children who are bilingual in French and English. So he did continue therapy later on, but it was much more successful when we had the Forbrain on, working on his focus and attention. So for both David and for Josie, especially for Josie, when they were wearing the Forbrain, it was like they were truly hearing themselves for the first time. Just the level of self-awareness just really shot through the roof. And they would just listen to themselves make their sounds in their microphone without me even asking them to make their sounds. They would want to hear their own voice in the microphone, listening to their target sounds, which is really nice because, I mean, as speech therapists, we're trying to get as many repetitions as possible of our target sounds, and then we're just happy to do it spontaneously, just to listen to their own voices. So here are the things that I've observed from using Forbrain with children with speech sound disorders. Huge improvement in self-awareness, and for me, this is the absolute game changer, why I will always use Forbrain for children with speech sound disorders. Children want to practice their target sounds spontaneously and independently. Like I said, we're not like kind of nagging them like 5 more repetitions, 5 more repetitions. They're just wanting to sit there and listen to themselves a little bit more. Improved motivation to participate. That could be because they think it looks cool, or maybe they like how it feels, or they like how it sounds. Not sure, but either way, I'll take it. Improved focus and attention for kids who are maybe a little bit more high energy, that has this kind of calming effect. And in my opinion, it really speeds up the process of therapy. And I think that is just down to the increased self-awareness. Obviously, if we're more self-aware, it boosts our auditory vocal loop. If we're aware, we're more likely to be able to self-correct. And self-correcting means we can start using our sounds in conversational speech. So I think it really speeds up the process of therapy, and I really like using it. So that is me for tonight. But if you have any questions, I will get to them now. Let me just stop sharing my screen with you guys, if I can find my mouse. Okay, let's see. Okay, so someone is saying, it's not really a question, it's a comment. A reading specialist. My grandson has severe problems with speaking, but understands 2 languages. That's great. He's almost 4, but his sentences are always a blur in the middle. There are many sounds he can't say. Well, I would say definitely go see your speech and language therapist. You could ask about Forbrain if they have one. Could be something to try. Can this be used in a school environment? I would say yes. It's quite discreet. Like I said, it's not wired or anything, so the child can wear it quite discreetly on their head. There's just the microphone. Of course, if you wear it inside a classroom, there will be like the initial, oh my goodness, what is he wearing, from other kids, but kids get used to stuff pretty easily. You would just need to obviously discuss with the teacher about how long you're wanting to keep it on for, whether you're doing 10 minutes or 15 minutes or longer, depending on what your goals are. Where are those cards for the sounds? Are you talking about, I'll tell you both anyway, these speech posters, I linked them on the auditory discrimination slide. So I will send you all the slides from today, so you can check out the links afterwards. These are from Teachers Pay Teachers. They cost $5 for the whole set. Absolutely love them. Cannot recommend them highly enough. Love them. If you were talking about these flashcards that I'm using, these ones are the Kaufmann speech to language protocol. And these are the ones, this is going to be backwards for you guys, sorry. These are the ones that have like the hierarchy on the back. So those ones are great too. Both are really good. Can the Forbrain be bought for schools, or does it have to do through speech? It can be bought by anyone. It's not a product that you have to be a therapist to buy one. Families can buy them, schools can buy them. You can just go to the Forbrain website and have a look. Can you get a test to measure what? I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. To measure Forbrain? I'm not sure. When I do testing as a speech and language therapist, I will assess the child initially, get my results from the assessment of how they're speaking or their language or their speech, whatever we're working on. And then I will take data in the sessions and just track kind of how they're doing. So I'm not really testing how Forbrain is working. I'm just testing overall whether the therapy I'm using is working, and I'm tweaking the therapy as I go, obviously, as any therapist would. Let me see if anyone, nope, no one's put anything in the Q&A. Perfect. So if anyone has any more questions, now is the time. We'll keep it going for a few more minutes in case you have any questions that kind of pop into your heads. Oh, someone's from New Zealand. Hello, fellow Kiwi. Teaching a 6-year-old student in New Zealand who is having difficulty pronouncing the short sound. It's more like an eh. Oh my goodness. Do you know, this is one that I really can't advise you on, because this is one that I have a difficult time with, because my accent obviously has changed. I don't sound like I'm from New Zealand anymore. And so the I and the eh for me are awful. I honestly don't know what to advise you on this, and I'm sorry, those are such difficult vowels. I know in New Zealand, they're maybe a little bit more different than they are in like a more American accent. Like in New Zealand, it is more like a like it's lower, and the eh is more like a e, like it's higher. I don't know what you could do for those ones. Tricky one. Let me think on it, and I'll try and get back to you. I will do a follow-up email with everyone, so I'll have a think on it, and I'll get back to you if I can think of any exercises to work on. Wonderfully concise and succinct. Thank you very much. Can you provide this video to watch again? Yes, so I will link the recording from tonight's webinar in the email that we'll send. It might not be until next week. I'm not sure. I'll have to check with the administrator. Would this be good when you're, I'm not sure what that word is. Karen Dent. Can you just clarify your question? I'm not sure what this word is. Would this be good for when you're in infants and a child has speech problems to use at sound time, like for cat? Maybe are you talking about school? Yes, you can use it for sure. Do you have any suggestions on how to work with older people who did not have speech therapy as children as they needed it? Ooh, that is a really tricky one. I personally don't work with those populations, but again, it's just going to be a matter of self-awareness. For sure, you could absolutely try the Forbrain, but it might be a lot of like listening to their own speech, looking in a mirror, just kind of getting them self-aware. Auditory discrimination. Speech is unfortunately a habit, and like any motor habit, if we don't work on it when we're smaller, it's really difficult to change when we're older. It's not impossible. I mean, like, look at me. I did not have this accent when I was younger. This accent came from living in a foreign country and speaking with people who have this accent for 7 years. Like, you absolutely can change your speech. It's just more difficult than when you're working with a child. My 20-month-old grandson does not say the typical dada or mama sounds. 20-month-old, I would say consult your speech therapist if you're having any concerns. It never hurts to contact a speech therapist. Definitely prefer to contact a speech therapist and for them to say, no, don't worry, than to try the wait and see approach and for it to not be the right approach. Did you notice any stuttering while using Forbrain? So very curious one. I stutter a little bit when I'm wearing Forbrain, and this is because it really is off-putting to me. So I think for some people, it does have this off-putting effect of, oh my goodness, I'm hearing my voice. Like, you know, when you're talking on the phone sometimes and you have this kind of feedback, like if your connection is not good and you can hear yourself coming through, and that can make you stutter. Forbrain can have that effect sometime on some people. It's a tricky one. I wouldn't say, it's definitely not for everyone, because it definitely does work for some people, but for some people like myself, it can be a little bit, what's the word, like perturbing, like it's very strange to listen to yourself. do you think by older, I mean 19-year-old, that may have motor issues rather than speech? Or, like apraxia issues rather than speech? Oh, thank you, Karen. Thank you for thanking me. Is it good for the parent to stop a child and make him repeat each word one by one if he runs the sentence together in an unintelligible blur? So I would say no. I think if a child is speaking, we should just kind of let them speak. Definitely that can become frustrating for both the parent and the child if we're stopping them all the time, if they're running the sentence in an unintelligible blur. I would say if the child is having issues with intelligibility, with like slurred speech, work on it in therapy and have your therapy time. But if you're stopping them all the time when they're trying to speak to you, that's going to make them discouraged from speaking to you. So I wouldn't say that all the time. I would say use therapy activities, use structured approach to target your multisyllabic words or working in specific phrases. But don't interrupt a child all the time. It's just going to be frustrating for both the parent and the child. Yeah, I'm just going back to this question about the child who has the slushy noise. He's almost 4 and understands everything, but no one understands him. If a child is 4 years old, they should be 100% intelligible. We say children who are 2 years old should be 50% intelligible. Children who are 3 years old should be 75% intelligible. By the time you're 4, you should be 100% intelligible. So if people don't understand him, definitely contact a speech and language therapist. In my experience working with adults, they can make good progress when using Forbrain. Thank you for this comment. That's great. I didn't know this. Not the population I work with. Auditory feedback is a great tool, but it depends on muscle development, use, coordinators of articulation. Yes, for sure. Do I have any experience with children with autism? Yes, I'm going to do a webinar on that next. It will probably be sometime in June. And I think the question is dyspraxia. Yes, I have worked with children with dyspraxia as well. Where can we find these exercises written? Well, you can receive the slides from this webinar. They'll be linked. I think the recorded version and the slides will be linked in the follow-up email that we will send. Like you described earlier about the young boy you worked with. Okay, so David, individual words can be pronounced. Okay, but later it's an intelligible. Okay. What is different about Forbrain and other headphones that have a microphone? Okay, so the difference with Forbrain is that it's using the bone conduction. So bone conduction is a really, really rapid way of having feedback. Basically, when we speak, we normally hear through air conduction. So it's going through our ears, which makes our little eardrum vibrate, our bones move, the liquid go in the cochlear, and then it stimulates the auditory nerve. So it's like a relatively slower process compared to bone conduction, where it vibrates on the bone and then that stimulates the auditory nerve directly. So it's really direct feedback. And then because we have the microphone, it's our voice slightly louder in real time. It's really, really weird. I cannot describe it to you well enough. All I can say is I recommend trying it, because you would not believe what it sounds like to hear your own voice loudly in real time until you try it. Every parent who I put it on, I always put it on the parents before I put it on the child. I'm like, here, try this on. I'm going to put it on your child, but you should see what it looks like first. They'll be like, oh, that's weird. Like, oh my goodness, I hear myself while I'm talking. So strange. So it's definitely different than just having a microphone and hearing yourself louder normally through air conduction. Oh, not a question concerning children. Can you use the Forbrain device with patients who had a larynx operation done? I have no idea. That is just not my field. I'm so sorry. That's like hospital, medical, SLT, SLP, and that's not my field. I'm so sorry. If any other speech therapists have worked in that field, please feel free to comment, but that's not my field. Is Forbrain helpful for people with hard of hearing? So I would say it depends which type of hearing loss you have. If you have sensory neural hearing loss, no. If you have conductive hearing loss, then maybe yes. So I have a little girl on my caseload who has sensory neural hearing loss, so it's the auditory nerve that's damaged, and for her, Forbrain is not helpful. I have also another little boy on my caseload who has like compounded earwax, and for him, I haven't tried it yet. He's very new. I've only had him on my caseload for a week, but I'm thinking Forbrain could be a goer for him, because actually it's just the air conduction channel that's blocked. But if we're using the bone conduction, then Forbrain could actually be really, really useful and help him hear a little bit clearer. So is it useful for people who are hard of hearing? Yes and no, depending on which type of hard of hearing you are. Anybody else before we finish? I'll wait for a few more minutes. What about working with a child? Oh, broken tympanic membrane. I would say yes, because again, we're using bone conduction. So we're stimulating our auditory nerve directly. So I will use this with children who have like otitis media, so chronic middle ear infections. I will use the Forbrain with, because again, we're just bypassing this air conduction and just using the bone conduction. So we know if a child has problems with hearing with otitis media, with anything to do with their little bones or their tympanic membrane, then the air conduction is not working well. They're not hearing themselves clearly. It can sometimes sound like, for them, it sounds like as if the world is underwater, like how we would hear if we were underwater in a swimming pool. That's kind of what it sounds like all the time for them. So for sure, if we can bypass that channel and use bone conduction instead, it definitely helps those types of kids. Thank you for an interesting webinar. You're welcome. Thank you so much for attending. Learned many new ideas today. Oh, thank you. That's kind. Thank you so much for the feedback. I'll wait just a couple more minutes if anyone has any last minute questions. Of course, you're going to get my email contact. I'm going to send an email through either end of this week or beginning of next week, depending on what happens with the administrator. But you'll have my email contact. So if you do have any questions that you think of after the webinar, you're more than welcome to contact me and let me know. Oh, thank you for the feedback. That's very kind. Okay. Well, I think no one's got any more questions, so I think we'll end it there. But thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for your very interesting questions. And I hope to see you at my next webinar. It's going to be probably sometime in June, and we're going to be talking about children with autistic spectrum disorder. So another very interesting topic. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.